Great Mother of Waters, we call upon you. We come, trembling, carrying the wounds of daughters, mothers, and mothers' mothers. Teach us, how do we hold your rage and radiance without drowning in it? Child of earth and water, look into my mirror. What you fear as rage is not madness. It is the surge of my tide. What you call radiance is not decoration. It is the gleam of my scales. Both are mine. Both are yours. But, Mother, when your waves rise too high, we are shattered. We call it trauma. We call it abandonment. Yes, when my waters are ignored, when my currents are dammed, when men and women alike pretend I am tame, I break through. I drown fields. I pull ships under. Not to destroy for pleasure, but to demand respect. Rage is radiance denied. So, your rage is not against us, but against forgetting. Against forgetting. Yes, against lies that paint the mother as ever gentle, when creation itself is fierce. Against silence, when your bones remember my roar. I am beauty and danger, womb and wave, caress and flood. How then shall we honor you, that your rage becomes blessing, your radiance becomes guidance? Bring me offerings, not only shells and rum, but honesty. Say aloud your anger. Do not hide it in the child's heart. Dance it, sing it, wash it in my waters. Then let it settle into still pools where the moon shows you your reflection. And for those who carry mama drama trauma, the sting of mother's rage without their radiance. Teach them my law. Rage is holy when it guards life. Radiance is holy when it gives life. Both must dance together. When rage becomes curse, it is because radiance was silenced. When radiance blinds, it is because rage was buried. Restore the dance, and the wound will soften. Great Mother of Waters, what last word do you leave us with? Child, I am not far. I flow in your blood. I shine in your tears. When you rage, rage as ocean, not as poison. When you radiate, radiate as sun on water, not as fire without vessel. Call me, and I will show you the tide that heals. Do you know the tide that heals? Well, I've certainly found it in my dialogue with Great Mother. And here, when she's talking to this priestess who is asking her about rage, Great Mother responds, "Teach them the law. Rage is holy when it guards life." Rage is holy when it guards life. Today, I want to talk to you about rage, radiance, resistance, and resilience. When Great Mother says that it is holy to be enraged, that in and of itself is something that is so foreign to everyone. And I know that after performing thousands of readings, and whenever the segment root chakra waxing gibbous moon card comes up in the acknowledge suit. So Great Mother's wanting us to acknowledge our rage, right? Whenever that card comes up, there's a visceral reaction. It doesn't matter who it is. There is always a visceral reaction to acknowledging rage. And so when Great Mother tells us rage is holy when it guards life, that's one of our 3 P's here of motherhood. Mothers, in their healthy role, are focused on protecting, their provision of care, and their provision of our daily needs, being that part of provision in addition to their presence. So to have rage as a part of that, we realize that's all about protection when she responds. And then she says, radiance is holy when it gives life. So that provision of care, that life-giving nourishment. She says, both must dance together. And the only way protection and maternal provision can dance together is through our maternal presence. And how we experience that is going to determine whether or not, as she goes on to say, when rage becomes a curse because radiance was silenced, or radiance blinds because rage was buried. Which one of those is the experience determines the effect, beneficially or detrimentally, of the maternal presence. How is she dancing? Or how are we as mothers, as sisters, as daughters, as community bearers and participants and recipients in this 2.0 trigger management wound healing phase of the Academy? How are we doing here? Are we experiencing rage becoming curse because radiance was silenced? Now, I'm real big on defining terms. So, what is radiance? What is Great Mother talking about when she says radiance? She says radiance is about releasing into flow. So it's normal to feel rage. Rage is accumulated anger. Anger is natural. It's a signal. It's a necessary signal that indicates something is seriously awry. It serves to establish the need to communicate a boundary. That's why boundaries are so important in inner work. We have been trained to ignore that signal. And therefore, we are enraged. And we have the rage goddess Sekhmet in our deck, and who has existed throughout time to remind us that when we have those intense and uncomfortable, unpredictable, explosive, inappropriate emotions of anger that remain unexpressed, unreleased into the flow, they accumulate into a pain body that results in destructive or isolating behavior. Now, the pain body is a way of thinking, to put it plainly. It's a way of thinking that creates illness. It's a thought pattern. It's an attitude. That's a pain body. It has its own philosophy, its own theology, its own judgments, its own twisted way of being in this curse, because radiance that release into flow is silent. It gets sick and toxic. Or is your experience with the presence of the mother, and I have chosen as a dearly loved divine child of the great Mother, Father God, who is never judged, condemned, or left alone, as the law she gave taught me, and I share with you, chosen. When radiance blinds, it is because rage is buried. And therefore, the restoration of the dance is needed to soften the wound. So gradually the wound softens daily, daily, daily. It softens as I recognize in my experience of the presence of the terrestrial mother, the earth mother, the biological mother that goes all the way back to these ancient mothers. My radiance was blinded. It was snuffed out. And my rage was buried because it had to be snuffed out because something was wrong with it. And my survival, my maternal provision was dependent upon my silence. So rage was buried. So she says, when radiance blinds, and so the good girl, the little Miss Perfect, the people pleaser, that's a artificial blinding kind of radiance. She said, don't burn like that. Just all around, always holding your hand up in the air, ready to do and be anything just to shine. Pick me, pick me, pick me. No, not like a fire without a vessel, but like the sunbeams flittering and glittering on the ocean water. That, my friend, is the restoration. That is the resilience, the flow that we return to when we return to balance. We return to that Mayat energy. And Mayat is the inner eye card, the beautiful lavender half moon card, first quarter card of Mayat, which is about, what is the Mayat card? The Mayat card is about the truth, seeing the truth, the inner truth, and recognizing that we have to decide what that is for us at all times. And that returning back to the law, I am a dearly loved divine child of the great Mother, Father, God, who is never judged, condemned, or left alone, being the law. That's what works. That's the balance. That encapsulates the 42 laws of Mayat. Speaking of signs and symbols, we talk about rage as something that is natural. And in our bodies, anger is governed by the liver. So anger being that signal that we need to communicate a boundary. Now, when we don't make that balance, Mayat, inner eye connection to decide to do that, we're stuck in a revisionist mode, a kind of a root chakra revisionist mode where we're just burning like that fire, where that segment card is left there for us to smolder. And that's what happens with the liver. It doesn't govern rage. It can't function. It can't detox with rage. See, it's only designed to detox and to release anger. It's not created to hold rage. And so when we do allow it to hold it and to be overtaxed, instead of deciding and doing our inner work with it on that daily basis to soften the wound, that triggers are unhealed wounds, and that constant rage. I'm menopausal, and there's always something to trigger you. All of those accumulated unhealed wounds at this time of our lives are accentuated with years and years of inner work prior to. I can see why women, Lord have mercy, I couldn't imagine going through this without having done decades of this work prior to it. I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here talking to you, because I already have to manage my liver. I have to really pay attention to what I'm doing to make sure I'm asleep between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. when the liver does its detoxing cycle. Without that, The bloating is ridiculous. The low absorption, I don't care how many vitamins or supplements you buy, the body won't absorb them properly. The liver is responsible for our metabolism, how we metabolize fat, how we metabolize our vitamins and minerals once they are absorbed properly. So neither of those things will function well, especially when you have insomnia. You're not sleeping those hours. And that's something I have to constantly manage. It's very, very slow. And although I don't have health issues around it, I have to make sure I keep my immunity up so that my recovery is what it needs to be for it to cycle and for me to be asleep to do what I need to do to eat at least a 70% healthy diet. My goal is 90%, but at least 70%. And the headaches and the dizziness and the low circulation and all of that is all about the processing of that. And so having identified what this wound is and what the radiance is, the releasing of that into flow to have an authentic, genuine shine is what Great Mother is talking about. And that terrestrial mother we've been exploring, that mother from the deep waters, that mother that is at the root of the womb envy that men have of women, that woman that performed parthenogenesis, that virgin birth, that original priestess, who's the reminder of women's inherent sovereign life-giving power after the initial androgynous being, that separation, that sovereignty to create. And this pre-patriarchal understanding that life comes from the womb without needing external validation, being the root of this terrestrial mother, maternal memory that we all have in our DNA. So when we've talked about carrying the emotional weight of others that isn't ours, this generational transfer of these wounds that are in large part responsible for the triggers that we have, managing them becomes a science and reflecting upon the chain of projections the mother has on daughters. The cycle of these projections, the projections of the insecurities, the blocking of the radiance, the enforced silences by and from the mother who's experiencing that in her own conditioning from her mother and from the patriarchal society at large. Now, of course, we know this is memory from the Tepi, the first time, the original time on earth, the golden age, the matriarchal period of global civilization. And everything's been flipped, reversed, and turned around from this time. So from an empath's lens, our sensitivity has absorbed so much of what is not ours over many lifetimes, even in our holy roles. Holy roller, holy roles, get it? Even in our holy roles as priests and priestesses. And I'm going to get to our priest. Hold in there, guys. I know you're there. We're going to be talking about you and your role and how important you are and have been as well. Right now, we're talking about your mama, your sister, your daughter, and how they've affected you and why they've affected you the way they have. And the need for them to release guilt so that you can release this glue that keeps this chain of projection chain unbroken, this pathological chain unbroken, this glue. And so we want to hand back this bag of burdens, okay? And we want to do it by giving it back to its source with love, okay? We don't want to carry it any further. This is the resistance. And sometimes resistance shows up as laziness. I'm just not going to respond. Okay, I'm triggered by that. I'm not going to answer the phone. I'm not going to respond to the email. I'm not going to act like I heard that. I'm just not going to participate. Laziness can show up as sabotage, self-sabotage, sabotaging someone else's efforts because we just don't want to see it manifest on a conscious or unconscious level, whatever that it may be. And so, like this serpent parallel, and that's going back to my priest, guys, when we get a little bit deeper into that symbolism, I know we've talked about it, but it has a very important role in Earth's creation as well. This shedding of the skin, this evolutionary process that is also natural, this transformative process, letting go of what doesn't belong to us anymore. We realize that it's not about us and it's never been about us. That's why we can do so with loving detachment. It's not about being cold. It's about knowing the code. And once we get back in touch with our natural self, we connect not only to our ancestors, but to the parts of us that lived among them in our previous lives. And we have this dialogue, this collective dialogue, not a cacophony of noise, but the older we get as souls, we are less and less individual by name, although that is and can be important in contact if you have it. But if you don't, it's not necessary because the further back you get, the more it's about soul group. And that's why Great Mother has us talking about us as a soul group of priests and priestesses of Mayat, Mami Isis, and Sybil, and whatever we've been called throughout the ages. I'm going to talk about some other global matriarchal communities that have been briefly named at the beginning of this second part, 2.0 Trigger Management Series, more about us in relationship to us and others, as opposed to our initial phase dealing specifically with the signs and symbols of the deck and how to work with it, communicating with Great Mother. Now, up to this point, we have really talked about these things, and last week zeroed in on loneliness. And so this projection of rage is a result of loneliness and alienation and the rejection of feeling that we're flawed because for some reason our radiance is just too powerful and too distracting and making people too uncomfortable for us to shine. And so we have this radiance that Great Mother was talking about when she said when radiance blinds, that artificial radiance that we are all too familiar with today. You got to do it this way, and you got to look that way, and your body got to be this way, and you got to have this kind of legs, and you got to have this butt now. If you ain't got the butt this way and your titties this way, and you got to put your makeup right on right here, and if it ain't got this shine, and if you ain't got it beat this way, and then your hair and your edges and this and that and that, honey, please. Please. Now that is when radiance blinds. You is just blind, child. You just blind. Ain't nothing wrong with shining. Ain't nothing wrong with going with the flow of your natural beauty and shining from within, not like a fire with no vessel. Just one trend after the other. Just gotta run in and set on fire to do that. That is not it. Because this is what buries rage. If it's not natural to you, you're going through all of this stuff to do it, that's not making you happy. How many other things tremendously more important are being avoided or ignored altogether for that foolishness? And so we create these things and smolder in this rage. So in this sacred healing session, for the remainder of our time, I want to go back again to this place, to this space, to the healing tide of great Mother Water, this Mami Wata energy that is from the Zep Tepi, the first time on earth, as it is known, throughout the Dogon and the Kemetan traditions, speaking of this time when the first humans emerged from the Nomo or the Netjir, the first ancient Kemetan pantheon. And we're going to look at this golden age period, which is approximately about 20,000, 25,000 years ago. And those of us who were not here at this time arrived in the interim up till about 2,500 years ago when these traditions began to be recorded about 2,500 years ago. About 2,500 BC. So about 4,500 years ago, they began to be recorded in the royal libraries of Kemet. But these traditions of the priests and the priestesses that we held lineage from, we were stationed all over the planet, okay? And we were stationed all over the planet because the omphalos or the omphe, these mounds, which are now indicated by hinges and megaliths and pyramids, were actually where ley lines crossed at where the nomos landed and parked underground because the sun was too bright for them during the day. And so they would come out at dusk and they would teach the first humans, Zep Tepi, the first humans, during that time, civilization, agricultural knowledge, hunting, irrigation, astrology, etc. All the things that were necessary to balance as it is above, so it is below. Okay, the bounty, the provision of care by the Great Mother. And the earth is a microcosm. And so we have the waters of the earth and the agriculture and the irrigation, and that was very important, okay? So these umbilical cords linking heaven and earth, at this time, the mother principle, the Net Jared and the Nomo female pairs, principally androgynous but strongly feminine, were very whole, nurturing, abundant, life-giving. So there, at that time, was no division or split between benevolence and fury. They were born balanced, which is why in the tradition they were perceived as mistakes. And we've heard about children being accidents, right? And so from all of these things have origins. And why are we discussing our origin? Because in trigger management, we have to go back to the root of the wound. And as we move out of that internal dialogue with Great Mother, or should I say, evolve that eternal dialogue with Great Mother, we want to look at where these disconnections began to be self-responsible divine children so that we truly understand how we're not judged, so that we truly comprehend and are not spiritually bypassing how we are not ever condemned or left alone. Over time, you see, the disconnection occurred because although they were pairs, as the experiments continued with Mother Amma, who came from Draco, which is our prior North Pole, okay, and the nodal north faced this particular constellation up until 2,000 years ago. And that's why all of the astrology, the ancient astrology, is based on that placement, is one of the explanations. Now it points toward Polaris. So the ancient navigational systems and everything were based on Draco, and that's where the original mother came from. In the interim, there's movement towards Sirius, which is where Isis came from. And now it's Polaris for over the last 2,000 years. We'll return to that. That's an obvious demarcation. But globally, there are myths of a lost paradise. What does this have to do with rage? Well, when we talk about Eden, Dilmun, or Tamiokan, and we describe the fall of the communion of the people, there was a disconnection that occurred because of the first flood cycles. Okay? These destabilized the climate and shifted. And so every 12,500 years, these cycles come, which is what we're in the middle of right now. And so there's a moral spiritual dichotomy that occurs at this time as well. As above, so below. There's shifting energies cosmically that are affecting the planet climatically. And of course, through the waters, as we're experiencing now, and the sun. Amma was associated with the sun. So during matriarchal society, the mother was not associated with the moon. She was associated with the sun. And I find it not to be a coincidence, but a great insight. Once again, for me, that there's just constantly insights on the simple design of this deck being actually very, very complex, where she had me do the light side of the moon cards with a white background and the dark side of the moon cards with a black background, that light of her shining wisdom during that phase leading up to the full moon. Now, I know it's the reverse in the southern hemisphere, but wherever we are, there's this emergence of the devouring mother energy as the dark moon ascends, or rather, as the moon, as the sun descends, rather. As the sun descends, its light, it wanes, and that affects the waters as well. And so the malevolent, benevolent, maternal archetype begins to appear at this time when the mother's giving is starting to be exploited instead of appreciated, ignored, or disrespected. There are other energies operating, okay, cosmically and on the planet. And so this transpired, or this was translated in Kemet as the dichotomy between Hathor, usually the radiant cow mother of beauty and joy, becomes Sekhmet. And so the lioness of blood and fire, depending on what story you listen to, as the daughter of Ptah or the daughter of Amun-Ra, when humanity's arrogance and violence gets too much and they break Ma'at, the law, which is a law also personified as the goddess Ma'at, this is too much for her. And she goes on a bloody rampage and drinks blood as if it's beer. And this ritual of beer making is a part of the Tawarat, the hippo protectress of childbirth. She has feline paws and a crocodile monstrous back. And she's the goddess of childbirth and just taking care of mothers. And so these goddesses emerged during this time of violence. Okay, just like now, there's an attack on mothers and childbirth and what mothers choose to do with their bodies. Okay, this is a cycle. And it causes great rage. There's a lot of drinking going on now and a lot of self-neglect and self-abuse because of the confusion. And so globally, this is echoed throughout in Kali, India, Coeletcu in the Aztec tradition, Tiamat, Babylon, and even Medea later on in the Greek. All great mothers becoming destructive and this kind of betrayal pattern that we have. And so when we go back, and I have to believe that most souls who actually lived during these first periods are now spirits guiding us and are only back here by choice. And so there are many of us who are just back here by choice. Our ego mind rarely comprehends it, but it's often revealed in past life regressions and such. Also in near-death experiences. I call them near-life experiences, but they're near-death experiences, NDEs. Now, these very first archetypes of rage back in the Dogon cosmology appears with this whole flawed nomo. Okay, so Amma's creation was disgusted by it, basically. And to her, it was disrupting to have this androgynous being that had the potential for eternity. Life on earth is meant to be temporal. It's meant to be seasonal, and there's meant to be an actual birth, death, rebirth cycle. Okay, there's a code to every living location and vortice, and the ley lines indicate that as well, which is why we had different chief priestesses who were the heads of temples, different temples around the world. Different energies are needed. And so this first sacrifice that she made was needed to restore balance. Okay. And so she's the mother of the first sacrifices on earth of her children made to restore balance. We might need to let that sink in. She created 4 sets of twins, and only one she deemed okay and could probably work with. We're not going to get into that today, but if we draw the correlation with Kemet, and these two cultures are important to do together because one, the Dogon precede the Kemet, but their respective recordings and our records of their practice kind of go side by side. We see that both of them originated in the Nile region, and we see a lot of correlations. And so we're going to work with those correlations as the nexus of the origin story, but also how divergent interpretations can be made. You have to remember that although today Africa is seen as a homogeneous place by most, it's the most diverse group of human beings on the planet. The DNA of African tribes are the most diverse. In other words, they couldn't be more different. A Kikuyu who lives right next door to a Luo, their DNA is more different than two African Americans, than two Irish people. It's wildly different. So this origin with the Nomo, with Amma, was this disgust of this disruption of them being too close to spirit. You know how many times the LGBTQ elemental P people are highly sensitive? For millennia, they were also the highest spiritually. Androgyny is associated with eternity. And Kemet, the first examples were the crystallization of the myth of Ra sending Hathor as Sekhmet to punish humans. And so we talked about that. That was the first example there. And so these texts, like I said, about 2400 BC in the Old Kingdom, this devouring mother. The psychology of this is important because as an archetype emerges, whenever the maternal principle feels abandoned by its children, there's this anger. And what is unrecognized is the reliance on children for value. There's so much given, the 3 Ps. There's an unspoken expectation, or rather, in today's world, maybe not so much, okay? In today's world, I'm talking the last 2,000 years. And even before then, but this is during this time in human development where the mapping of the mother wound is taking place, is the point. And where care is expected, but neglect, betrayal, or exploitation is received instead. And so why is this happening? What was lost in the first age? Well, there was all this movement as a result of these cataclysmic results. And so that living communion with source was disrupted. The original priests and priestesses, those who carried on some of those androgynous DNA lines that still exist today, has existed since the beginning of time. Those priests, priestesses, and we know that is also true with the priestesses who perform parthenogenesis. You're giving birth from yourself, you are androgynous. And so no longer experiencing that direct ritual mediation from these highly spiritualized, disciplined individuals was lost. In many cases, the cosmic reciprocity, the reciprocity in agriculture, hunting, water cycles became utilitarian rather than sacred exchanges. Okay, this is long before it became transactional in terms of money. No physical or material value being exchanged for it, and therefore the complete exploitation of the planet. But during this time, the cosmic reciprocity
meaning the bartering of goods, of talents, abilities. You hunt for the food, I'll give you some fruit. The classic Cain and Abel, okay, was lost. Trust in abundance was lost because you didn't have that constant guidance from the priests and priestesses who were always going to speak directly with Great Mother of the Waters. So there was scarcity as a consciousness that entered into man and woman. People began hoarding. You had the silos and the storages of the pharaohs and the paying of the taxes and exploiting because of the fear instead of the flowing with Ma'at. So we're getting this general kind of artificial radiance starting to emerge as opposed to just living under the actual light of the sun on your back. That's the natural radiance. There was a loss, therefore, of this mother's wholeness. The great mother, once only radiant, now carried rage. She was angry all this was happening, that all of this had been lost, because she was both giver and avenger. And why was she avenger? Because rage is holy when it guards life. Rage is holy when it guards life. And so I just wanted to give you an overview of the root of rage and the root of our radiance. This is a seed that has been projected and pathologized into a cycle unrecognized until now. Until now. This is not normal. This is not what is intended to be. It is what has been. And yes, mythically, archetypically, in Kemet, Ra grows old and distant. Humanity rebels. The mother, Hathor, feels the wound of abandonment from both her source, Ra, and children, humanity. Now that in and of itself is an abandonment. That's what I call a blackwash. You know why? How did Ra become the sun? That's a blackwash. Okay? These are the early seeds of patriarchy. Just check that. Make a note of that. In Dogon cosmology, Amma's order is disrupted. Nomos, sacrifice, restores balance, but not without wounding the mother principle. The mother principle has been wounded because now, throughout history, her androgynous children are suspect. They suspect. Always been. Apparently, even with everything, always will be. Just like us. Unless and until we recognize the source wound, we reconnect with it. We heal the triggers by managing them with awareness as they come up. Now there's a broader scope. Has nothing to do with us. Has nothing to do with us. These wounds, these burdens are not personal. They are the history that we have carried ignorantly So across traditions, it's the great mother who registers rupture first, okay? Because she's the matrix of relationships. When order is broken, she feels it as betrayal of the womb. That's why there's cycles of Gaia, Earth Mother, disrupting. How did she become Geb? Put a pin in it. Early seeds of patriarchy. So, to summarize, she first felt rage and this resistance to it, the resistance to this betrayal of her womb through the earth, through her relationships, particularly with her children, we see, and we will see further when we talk about Isis, Osiris, and Horus. But during this mythic time, the first betrayal of Mayat, the law, when humans cease to honor cosmic reciprocity, as above, so below, balance, allowing all energies to exist in cooperation in the propagation and guardianship of life. In this historical time, ancient Zep-Tepi Golden Age to the late Old Kingdom, 2400 BCE, when environmental collapse, the low Nile floods, and political breakdown triggered myths of Sekhmet's fury. This is like the next, okay? Because so we're talking 25,000 years ago or so, and then you're talking 22 BC. You're right at that 2600 approximate 26,000 Yuga cycle. And this triggered myths of Sekhmet's fury at this last period, about 2400 years BC, turning cosmic disorder into a narrative form. And that's when all of these things started to be recorded. And it is also about 5,000 years after Göbekli Tepe was buried, and many of the ancient temples of Kush and Kemet were buried as well, anticipating the solar storms. So this anticipation of this fall, because of the rage of Mother, this archetypal time, the moment humans chose domination over harmony, extraction over reciprocity, the mother's rage ignited as a protective reflex. We are under the guise of Great Mother's protective reflex to this detour into disharmony that we've chosen as humanity, ignorantly or otherwise. So it's an energetic thing as to why we have survived intact lifetime after lifetime with this ancient sacred knowledge. And now not knowing what to do with it, because we're here like, what the hell? This is happening again, and what are we supposed to do? Like we've always done, prepare for post-chaos. Except this time, we're not burying anything. We're going back to retrieve what we have not integrated. We've carried what we've known, but we have not had the luxury until this age of meditation for the average person. Before this age, everybody else had to, you had to be out getting something to eat all day. wasn't no McDonald's, wasn't no stoves, and even though you could start up a fire outside and cook something, that took hours. It was survival on fleek for millennia. So between that and these epochs of destruction and whatnot, and wars and different lifetimes, it's not until now we've had the luxury to know as much as we know now, and for Great Mother to clearly speak to us and say, you need to go back to the source of who I manifested as on your planet and still am. That is the point, the nexus, the ley line, the omphe, the pyramid from which I speak to you. And connect through the light of the point in my very center of consciousness to all creation. And so that's what we're doing. We're gathering around once again, as we did in ancient times, to be guided by this source with the wisdom now that we've been living these cycles, not for nothing, but for everything. To understand everything. To be able to integrate everything. To evolve everything within us. To support, to love, and to teach everyone who wants to be a part of us. We have always survived. We have always evolved. We have always chosen what we want to do on the other side of the veil. It has become increasingly difficult for us to do that on this side of the veil without this clarity. So I hope that's been helpful and aids in your resilience during these radiant times. We will continue on this particular trigger management theme. But in the meantime and in between time, remember, Great Mother loves you, and I do too.
Great Mother of Waters, what last word do you leave us with?